Hey there, night owls and history buffs. Tonight, we're taking a long, leisurely journey back to a time when milk was delivered to your doorstep in glass bottles, when rotary phones were cutting edge technology, and when a family could pile into a brand new Chevrolet Bel Air for less than $3,000. We're talking about the 1950s, an entire decade of American life that's slowly fading from living memory, taking with it hundreds of everyday objects, customs, and conveniences that once seemed as permanent as the sky above. Before we drift into this nostalgic exploration, I want to ask you something. If you're enjoying these slow paced journeys through history, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more of these deep dives into forgotten eras, subscribe to the channel, but only if it genuinely speaks to you. There's no pressure here. We're just a community of people who appreciate the slower rhythms of storytelling, who understand that not everything needs to happen at internet speed. Now, settle in, maybe dim the lights, pour yourself something warm, because we're about to spend the next few hours together remembering a world that existed just 70 years ago, but feels like another planet entirely. A world without smartphones, without streaming services, without the internet. A world where change happened slowly enough that you could watch it unfold, where a product could stay on store shelves for decades without being considered outdated. The 1950s sit in this interesting place in American memory. They're close enough that some of you listening might actually remember them, might have childhood memories of pedal pushers and drive-in movies and the smell of your grandmother's Pyrex casserole dishes. But they're also far enough away that for many of us, they exist only in black and white photographs and old television shows, a half remembered dream of chrome bumpers and perfectly coiffed hair. What made the 50s so distinctive wasn't just what was there, it was the specific combination of post war optimism, new prosperity, and technological innovation that hadn't quite figured out where it was going yet. This was an era caught between the old world and the new, where households might have a television but still got their news from the evening paper, where women wore gloves and hats to go shopping but were starting to question whether they really wanted to spend their whole lives as housewives. The decade emerged from the shadow of World War II with a sense of relief and possibility. Young men who'd fought overseas returned home, started families, bought houses in the newly constructed suburbs, and went to work in the booming post war economy. Their wives, many of whom had worked in factories during the war effort, were encouraged to return to domestic roles, to embrace homemaking as both duty and aspiration. The GI Bill made homeownership and college education accessible to millions who'd never had such opportunities before. The American middle class expanded dramatically, and with it came a consumer culture that would define the nation for generations. This was the decade when many things we take for granted today were new, experimental, even radical. Television was still novel enough that families would gather around their one set, watching the same programs together because that was all that was on. The interstate highway system was just beginning, promising to connect the nation in ways previously unimaginable. Suburbs were spreading across former farmland, creating new communities and new ways of living. Supermarkets were replacing corner grocery stores, offering unprecedented variety and convenience. Fast food restaurants were emerging, promising quick meals for families on the go. Credit cards were being introduced, changing how Americans thought about purchasing power and debt. But here's what's fascinating about looking back at this decade from our current vantage point. So many things that were absolutely everywhere in the 1950s, things that seemed like they'd be around forever, have completely vanished, not just outdated, not just replaced by newer versions, completely gone. When was the last time you saw someone using a cigarette case? When did you last encounter a milk chute in someone's home? How long has it been since you've seen actual carbon paper? These weren't niche items. These were things that millions of Americans used every single day, and now they've evaporated so thoroughly that if you tried to explain them to someone born after the year 2000, they'd look at you like you were describing artifacts from ancient Rome. Tonight, we're going to remember 500 of these vanished things. 500 objects, customs, products, and practices that defined daily life in the 1950s America, but have now slipped through the cracks of history. This isn't going to be a rushed countdown. We're going to take our time, painting pictures with words, letting each item breathe, giving you space to remember or imagine what life was really like when these things filled American homes and streets and stores. Some of these forgotten things were genuinely useful and probably shouldn't have disappeared. Others were completely ridiculous and deserved their fate. Most of them fall somewhere in between, products of their specific moment in time that simply couldn't adapt when the world moved on. But all of them tell us something about who we were, what we valued, and how differently we lived just a lifetime ago. The items we'll explore tonight range from the mundane to the remarkable. Kitchen appliances that promise to revolutionize cooking, fashion accessories that no properly dressed person would leave home without, toys that captivated children's imaginations without screens or batteries, cars that were as much about style as transportation, foods that seemed perfectly normal at the time, but would baffle modern eaters, household items that made daily life possible in ways we've now forgotten, communication devices that connected people before the digital age, beauty products that shaped how people presented themselves to the world. Each of these forgotten things existed within a larger cultural context that's also largely vanished. The 50s operated on different assumptions about gender roles, family structure, work, leisure, and what constituted the good life. These objects were props in a social drama that played out very differently than our current reality. Understanding them helps us understand not just what people used, but how they lived, what they aspired to, what constrained them, and what possibilities they could or couldn't imagine. So let's begin. Let's open that door to 1955, to 1958, to 1952, and see what we find inside. The 1950s kitchen was a temple of chrome, formica, and optimism about the future. This was the decade when American households truly embraced electrical appliances, when cooking became less about survival and more about style and efficiency. But the specific gadgets that filled those pastel colored kitchens, well, most of them have vanished so completely you'd never know they existed. Let's start with the lever style metal ice cube trays. These weren't just ice trays, they were engineering marvels of their time, first patented in 1949. You'd fill them with water, place them carefully in your freezer compartment, and when the ice was ready, you'd pull a lever that would crack the cubes free with a satisfying metallic sound. They were marketed under names like Magic Touch and Honeycomb, and for a few glorious years in the 50s, they were in practically every refrigerator in America. The aluminum construction meant they were durable, heavy things. You could probably defend yourself with one if necessary. But when flexible plastic trays arrived, and especially when built in ice makers became standard, these metal contraptions became obsolete almost overnight. Today, if you find one at an antique store, it's a curiosity, a reminder of a time when getting ice required more effort than pressing a button on your refrigerator door. Then there was the Sunbeam Mixmaster, which wasn't just a mixer but a symbol of modern kitchen efficiency. This wasn't a handheld device. It was a substantial countertop appliance, heavy enough that it needed its own permanent spot in your kitchen. The classic Mixmaster came in that distinctive white, sometimes with colorful accents in pastels like pink, turquoise, or yellow that matched the kitchen color schemes of the era. It could mix, beat, and whip with a variety of attachments that could be swapped out for different tasks. What made it special was its engineering. This thing was built like a tank, with metal gears and a powerful motor that could handle the thickest doughs without straining. People who still have their grandmother's mix master from the 50s report that it still works perfectly, still mixes cake batter and whips cream without complaint. The sound it made was distinctive, a steady mechanical hum that became part of the soundtrack of baking day. But that durability was also its downfall in our modern disposable economy. Why make something that lasts 60 years when you can make something that lasts 6 and sell people 5 more in between? The Mixmaster represented an era when appliances were investments, built to last a lifetime, designed to be repaired rather than replaced. The Westinghouse roaster represented another approach to 50s cooking technology. This was essentially a portable electric oven, but calling it that doesn't capture how revolutionary it seemed at the time. With its 18-quart capacity, you could roast an entire turkey, bake pies, make pot roasts, all without heating up your main oven. For families hosting large gatherings, which was much more common in the 50s than it is today, the Westinghouse roaster was a godsend. But as regular ovens got bigger and more efficient, and as entertaining became more casual, these bulky appliances lost their appeal. You can still find them sometimes, usually in the basement of someone's grandmother's house, still in working condition, waiting patiently for one more Thanksgiving dinner that will never come. Coffee in the 50s was a different ritual entirely, and the stovetop percolator was at the heart of it. Today, most of us think of percolators as those electric devices that sit on the counter, if we think of them at all. But in the 50s, making coffee meant putting a metal percolator directly on the stove, watching through the glass knob as the dark liquid burbled up and over the grounds. Listening to that distinctive perking sound that signaled morning was officially here. The Italian mocha pot was also popular, especially among families who wanted to feel sophisticated and European. These weren't convenience devices. Making coffee took time, attention, and a certain amount of skill. But the result was a ritual, a performance, a way of starting the day that involved all your senses. When automatic drip coffee makers arrived, they were faster and easier, sure, but something was lost in the translation. The Toastmaster toaster deserves its own moment of appreciation. This wasn't like modern toasters that hide your bread inside a plastic shell. The Toastmaster was Art Deco styled, sleek, minimalist, often made of gleaming chrome that reflected the morning light. It pioneered the pop up feature, ending the era of burnt toast and kitchen fires, and it looked better than pretty much any appliance in your kitchen today. But looking good wasn't enough to save it. Modern toasters are cheaper to manufacture, easier to store, and have more features, even if most of those features are unnecessary and half of them don't work. The Toastmaster represented a philosophy of design that valued aesthetics as much as function, a philosophy that didn't quite survive into our era of planned obsolescence. Top loading dishwashers were common in 50s kitchens, though dishwashers themselves were still luxury items for many families. These weren't like the front loading models we use today. You'd open them from the top, load your dishes into an internal basket, and watch through a window as a spinning jet of water did its work. They were less efficient than modern dishwashers, sure, and they took up more counter space, but there was something satisfying about the visibility of the process, about watching your dishes actually getting clean. When front loading models proved more practical, top loaders disappeared, joining the long list of transitional technologies that work perfectly well but lose out to something marginally better. Let's talk about the electric egg poacher, because this was such a quintessentially 50s solution to a problem that didn't really need solving. These specialized appliances featured individual cups suspended above water, essentially steaming eggs rather than actually poaching them. Throughout the 50s and 60s, they offered reliability over skill, consistency over craft. You didn't need to know how to properly poach an egg when you had an electric egg poacher. Just crack the eggs into the cups, turn it on, and wait. The result was reliably round eggs perfect for Eggs Benedict, even if they weren't technically poached in the traditional sense. These devices showed how mid century kitchens embraced specialized gadgets before the minimalist movement pushed back against kitchen clutter. Today, people who know how to properly poach an egg wonder why anyone thought an entire appliance was necessary, while people who don't know shake their heads at the idea of owning a device that does exactly one thing. Hand cranked ice crushers were essential for anyone who wanted to make cocktails or entertain in style. This wasn't a push button, plug it in situation. You'd load ice cubes into the top, turn a crank, and watch as crushed ice came tumbling out the bottom. It required actual physical effort, which sounds ridiculous now, but in the 50s, before the ubiquity of crushed ice dispensers, this was just how you did it. The sound of ice being crushed was part of the soundtrack of 50s entertaining, right up there with the clink of cocktail shakers and the scratch of a record needle finding its groove. The toaster oven represented General Electric's vision of the future, introduced in 1957 to a public hungry for innovation. Unlike today's versions that can practically cook a full meal, the original could make toast on top and heat bagels, or produce a melted cheese sandwich in the bottom drawer. That was it. But that was enough. For families learning to use electric appliances, for households where counter space was precious, but convenience was paramount, the toast R oven was a glimpse of what kitchens might become. It spawned an entire category of appliances that would evolve over decades, even though the original 50s version seems charmingly limited by modern standards. Ringer washers deserve more than a passing mention because they represent such a stark contrast to modern laundry. These machines didn't spin your clothes dry. Instead, you had to feed wet laundry through two rollers that squeezed out the water through brute force. It was a chore that required attention and caution because you could easily catch your fingers, your hair, or your clothing in those relentless rollers. Multiple women suffered injuries from wringer washers, sometimes serious ones. But for large families washing loads and loads of laundry, these machines were still considered lifesavers compared to washing everything by hand. When fully automatic washers became affordable, wringer washers vanished with a speed that suggests just how much people hated using them. Good riddance, really, although they do make for interesting museum pieces now. Electric fondue pots burst onto the scene in the late 50s and became the must have item for fashionable hosts. These colorful tabletop appliances turned dinner into interactive entertainment, allowing guests to dip bread cubes into hot cheese or fruits into chocolate right at the table. The fondue pot was more than just a cooking device. It was a symbol of sophistication, of European influence on American culture, of the growing emphasis on entertaining at home. Every color of the rainbow was available: harvest gold, avocado green, burnt orange. They matched the color schemes that dominated 50s decor. When dinner party culture shifted toward more casual entertaining, fondue pots lost their central role, relegated to the back of the closet alongside other relics of a more formal era. Butter curlers were tiny tools that turned a mundane task into an art form. These small, grooved utensils would shave curls of butter off a cold stick, creating decorative shapes for serving. This level of attention to presentation seems almost unthinkable today, when we're more likely to just plop a stick of butter on the table and call it good. But in the 50s, when entertaining was more formal and presentation mattered, taking the time to curl your butter was just what you did. It showed you cared. It showed you had standards. It showed you respected your guests enough to make even the butter beautiful. The fact that butter curlers have disappeared tells us something about how much more casual and hurried our lives have become. Vibrating carving forks represented the 50s obsession with making everything electric, even when it didn't necessarily improve the experience. These forks, often sold alongside electric knives, would vibrate to supposedly help hold the roast steady while carving. The reality was that they offered minimal assistance and maximum novelty. You didn't really need your fork to vibrate. A regular sturdy fork worked just as well and didn't require batteries or plugs. But for a moment in time, these gadgets sold well because they felt futuristic, because they suggested that electricity could improve every aspect of food preparation, even the parts that were already working fine. The Electro Chef combo tried to solve space problems in small city apartments by combining a refrigerator and stove into one unit. This mammoth appliance weighed about 500 pounds and could defrost, bake, and cook simultaneously while keeping your milk cold below. It featured an internal revolving shelf that ensured even cooking. Moving one of these on moving day must have been an absolute nightmare, requiring multiple strong people and probably some engineering expertise. But for apartment dwellers in the 30s and 40s who didn't have space for separate appliances, it represented an experimental approach to kitchen design. By the 50s, it was already becoming obsolete as apartments got bigger and appliances got better, but for a brief moment, it seemed like the future. It represented the kind of ambitious, slightly impractical thinking that characterized early home appliance design. Grated cheese in cans was another 50s innovation that seems bizarre now. Chef Boyardee and other brands sold canned grated cheese specifically to accompany their spaghetti dinner products. The cheese came ready to sprinkle, no refrigeration needed until opened, no grater required. For busy housewives who were learning to rely on convenience foods, this made perfect sense. Why grate cheese when someone else could do it for you and put it in a can? Of course, fresh grated cheese tastes better, and modern pre grated cheese in resealable bags is more convenient than cans, so this particular innovation didn't last. But it existed, and people bought it, and for a few years, canned grated cheese was a perfectly normal thing to have in your pantry. The 50s kitchen was filled with dozens more specialized gadgets: manual can openers that mounted on the wall, their sharp cutting wheels requiring actual muscle to operate, pressure cookers that whistled and hissed alarmingly, occasionally exploding if you didn't watch them carefully, rotisseries that slowly turned chickens on spits while you watched through a glass window, egg separators, potato ricers, meat grinders that attached to the edge of your counter. Each of these tools had its moment, its constituency of devoted users who couldn't imagine cooking without them, and each of them eventually lost out to simpler methods, more versatile appliances, or changing tastes that made their specific function obsolete. What ties all these kitchen items together is that they represent a particular philosophy about cooking and home life. The 50s kitchen was a laboratory of efficiency, a showroom for the latest technology, a statement about modern living. Having the right appliances showed you were forward thinking, that you'd made it into the middle class, that you valued convenience and progress. These weren't just tools, they were symbols, and when they disappeared, they took with them a whole way of thinking about domestic life, about what it meant to be modern, about the relationship between technology and everyday tasks. Fashion in the 1950s followed strict rules that most people today would find absolutely suffocating. But those rules created a distinctive look that's instantly recognizable, a silhouette and style that's been endlessly recycled and referenced ever since. Yet many of the specific items that people actually wore, the accessories that completed those carefully coordinated outfits, have vanished so thoroughly that they might as well have never existed. The poodle skirt stands as probably the most iconic piece of 50s fashion, though its origins trace back slightly earlier. Designer Julie Lynn Charlotte created it in 1947, and by the early 50s, it had become the defining garment of teenage girls across America. These wide, swingy circle skirts were typically made of felt and featured applique designs. The poodle was the most famous motif, a nod to the era's fascination with French culture and sophistication, but variations soon emerged. Frogs, racehorses, pink elephants, record players, anything that could be cut out of felt and stitched onto fabric. These personalized touches allowed teenagers to express individuality within the constraints of acceptable fashion. The skirts were usually worn with petticoats underneath to make them stand out even more, creating that distinctive bell shape. When the 60s arrived with its shift towards sleeker, more streamlined silhouettes, poodle skirts became instant relics of an era that suddenly seemed hopelessly old fashioned. But it wasn't just the skirts themselves, it was everything that went with them. Bobby socks, for instance, those white ankle socks that teenage girls wore with saddle shoes or penny loafers. Today, they're so strongly associated with the 50s that wearing them is essentially a costume, a deliberate throwback. But at the time, they were just what you wore: clean, white, folded down precisely, part of the uniform of being a teenage girl in the 1950s America. And then there were the dog collars on bobby socks, a bizarre fad where teenage girls would wear actual dog collars around their ankles as fashion statements. The side you wore it on could indicate whether you were dating or single. The color could signify various things, though the exact meanings varied by region. It was a whole language of accessorizing that's been completely lost, a way teenagers communicated their social status through tiny fashion choices that seem completely arbitrary now. Gloves were non negotiable for any properly dressed woman in the 50s. This wasn't optional. Without gloves, you were not properly accessorized. A woman's wardrobe would have included two different types: short gloves in leather or wool for daytime public outings, and long gloves for evening events. The gloves needed to be clean, which required regular washing and meticulous care. White or cream were the most favored colors, presumably because they showed how clean you were, how much attention you paid to details. Handbags often had special grip clasps or rings, specifically designed to help a woman keep track of her gloves when she removed them. The amount of mental energy devoted to glove management in the 50s was staggering. Where are my gloves? Are they clean? Do they match my outfit? Did I remember to bring them? When the 60s and 70s brought more casual fashion standards, gloves became optional, then uncommon, then virtually extinct except for cold weather. Today, the idea of wearing gloves to go shopping seems utterly bizarre, like something from another planet. Pillbox hats represented Balenciaga's contribution to 50s headwear, though they're more strongly associated with Jackie Kennedy in the early 60s. But throughout the late 50s, these small, brimless hats were everywhere, perched at precise angles on carefully styled hair. Hats in general added the final touch of glamour to a woman's outfit, particularly in the early 50s when they were still considered essential. Last year's dress could be completely updated with a new hat or a fresh ornament. Millinery suppliers sold elaborate decorations: flowers, autumn leaves and acorns, bunches of cherries, even tiny fruits that looked good enough to eat. Women would customize their hats seasonally, changing the decorations to match the time of year or their mood. As the decade progressed and as casual styles became more acceptable, hats became less necessary, less common, until they finally became almost entirely optional. Today, outside of certain religious contexts or special occasions, women wearing hats is unusual enough to draw attention. Spectacles in the 50s were facial accessories in their own right. These weren't subtle frames trying to be invisible. 50s glasses were bold, often cat-eye shaped with exaggerated wings at the outer corners that flared like butterfly wings. They were frequently inlaid with diamante or scattered with glitter dust. Think of Dame Edna Everidge's glasses, and you've got the essence, though somewhat exaggerated. The pointy wings would probably be considered a health hazard today. You could definitely injure someone with those things. But they made a statement. They turned a visual aid into a fashion choice. When large plastic frames became fashionable in later decades, then transitioned to smaller wire frames, and finally evolved into the variety of styles we see today. Those distinctive cat-eye glasses became instant markers of their era. Cocktail rings represented another uniquely 50s accessory. Though they first appeared in the 1920s during the speakeasy era, they didn't become a public trend until the 50s, after wartime restrictions ended and people wanted to embrace entertainment and elegance again. A true cocktail ring was big, impossible to miss, featuring large gemstones in elaborate settings. The whole point was to be noticed, to sparkle and catch the light while you held your martini or champagne glass. These rings were statements of success, of having arrived, of being sophisticated enough to attend cocktail parties where such jewelry was appropriate. Today, large statement rings are still around, but they've lost that specific cultural context, that association with a particular kind of formal, adult entertaining that characterized 50s social life. 1952, though the masses initially rejected them. Why? Because the early shaping was terrible compared to fully fashioned seamed stockings. Seamed stockings weren't just practical, they had their own aesthetic appeal. The line running up the back of a woman's leg created a certain look, a visual that photographers and film directors learned to use. Women would check their seams using a back mirror or get a sister or friend to make sure everything was straight. Crooked seams were a fashion disaster. When seamless stockings finally improved enough to gain approval later in the 50s, something was lost. That ritual of checking your seams, that visual element of seamed legs, gradually disappeared. Modern pantyhose and tights are so far removed from those carefully maintained 50s stockings that they're barely the same category of clothing. Men's fashion in the 50s also had its forgotten elements. The teddy boy look, which originated in England but influenced American style, featured extremely narrow trousers, velvet collared jackets, and heavily greased hair worn in quiffs. These young working class men adopted and adapted upper class styles for their own purposes, creating a distinctive rebellion through fashion. The name came from Edward, referring to Edwardian styles they were reviving. What was significant wasn't just the clothes themselves, but what they represented. The first time young working class men could afford relatively expensive clothes and had the confidence to create their own style rather than merely copying their elders. The bullet bra, also called circle stitch, whirlpool, or uplift bra, created that distinctive conical shape that defined 50s female silhouettes. These brasiers were initially designed to provide maximum support for bustier women, but the pointed shape became fashionable in its own right. Slimmer women even wore purposely exaggerated versions as a fashion statement rather than for support. The bullet bra was so specifically of its era that when bra design evolved toward more natural shapes in the 60s, these pointed designs became instant anachronisms, relics of a very particular attitude toward female beauty and fashion. Sweater clips were small chains with clips on each end that attached to the front of your cardigan, keeping it closed without having to button it. They often featured decorative elements, little faux pearls, rhinestones, or ornate metal work. For teenage girls and young women trying to achieve that perfect, casually elegant look, sweater clips were essential accessories. They've completely disappeared now, replaced well, by just buttoning your sweater if you want it closed, or leaving it open if you don't. But for a brief moment in the 50s, these little chains were everywhere, twinkling on cardigans across America. Scarves were elevated to an art form in 50s fashion. Companies like Vera Neumann created vibrant, hand screened silk scarves with bold patterns inspired by nature, abstract art, and modern design. These weren't just functional items to keep your neck warm. They were fashion statements, collectibles, ways to add personality and color to an outfit. Women learned elaborate ways to tie and wear scarves around the neck, in the hair, as a belt, attached to a handbag. Vera scarves in particular became highly sought after, each one signed with her distinctive name in the corner. Today, while scarves certainly still exist, they've lost that central role in women's wardrobes. That expectation that every properly dressed woman would have an extensive scarf collection and would wear them regularly as part of her standard accessories. The level of coordination required for 50s fashion seems exhausting from our modern perspective. Your shoes needed to match your handbag. Your gloves needed to coordinate with your hat. Your jewelry needed to work together as sets rather than being mixed and matched. Everything needed to be color coordinated, not just approximately, but precisely. Fashion magazines and etiquette books laid out exact rules for what to wear when, what colors were appropriate for which seasons, how to transition from day wear to evening wear. The idea of just throwing on whatever feels comfortable without worrying about whether it all matches perfectly would have seemed sloppy, disrespectful, possibly even scandalous. The 1950s were the golden age of toys, that magical period when American children had more playthings than kids from any previous generation, but before electronic entertainment took over entirely. The toys that filled 50s playrooms and bedrooms were ingenious, simple, and built to last. Many were dangerous by modern standards, and most have been completely replaced by digital alternatives. But oh, what toys they were. Mr. Potato Head made his debut as an invention in 1949, created by George Lerner, though it wasn't until 1952 that Hasbro began manufacturing and distributing it widely, making it the first toy ever advertised on television. Here's what many don't realize about those early versions. The original Mr. Potato Head didn't come with a plastic potato body. Instead, you got a set of plastic facial features with pins on them, and you were supposed to stick them into real potatoes or any other vegetables you had lying around. Parents complained about rotting vegetables, and government safety regulations stepped in, so Hasbro started including a plastic body in 1964. But for those first years, kids across America were stabbing facial features into actual produce, creating temporary vegetable people that would eventually decompose into something horrifying. The toy has remained in production ever since, appearing in the Toy Story movies and becoming part of American cultural iconography. But those original sets, with their vegetable stabbing chaos, are forgotten relics now. The Slinky was invented by Richard James in 1943, but it became a 50s phenomenon after being demonstrated at Gimbel's department store in 1945, Philadelphia, where it sold 400 units in 90 minutes. By the 50s and 60s, the Slinky had become a household name, famous for its ability to walk downstairs end over end, to flow from hand to hand, to create those mesmerizing metallic sounds. The physics of how it worked fascinated children and adults alike. The original Slinky was made of metal, not plastic, which meant it could get tangled into nightmarish knots that were almost impossible to fix. When your Slinky got kinked, it was pretty much ruined. But when it worked properly, it was pure magic, a toy that seemed to defy gravity through nothing but coiled metal and momentum. Modern Slinkies still exist, but they lack something of the original's charm, that sense of simple mechanical wonder that characterized the best 50s toys. The hula hoop swept across America in 1958 like a cultural tidal wave. Though the practice of hooping had existed for centuries in various cultures around the world, it took the vision of Whammo founders Richard Knurr and Arthur Spud Mellon to turn it into a modern phenomenon. After observing Australian children twirling bamboo hoops around their waists, they realized they could manufacture colorful plastic versions for the American market. The original hoop was 40 inches in diameter, though smaller versions for young children were also available. What followed was a genuine craze, one of those cultural phenomena where suddenly everyone, and I mean everyone, was hooping. In yards, at parks, at schools, at parties. The hula hoop became shorthand for 50s fun, for that particular brand of innocent outdoor activity that defined childhood in that era. The craze eventually died down, as crazes always do, but the hula hoop never completely went away. It evolved, adapted, and eventually found new life in hoop fitness classes using weighted versions. But those original plastic hoops in their bright primary colors, those are the ones that live in cultural memory. Play Doh represents one of those fortunate accidents where a product designed for one purpose finds unexpected success in another. Historical accounts indicate it was originally manufactured in the 1930s as a wallpaper cleaner, specifically formulated to remove coal residue from walls. When the wallpaper cleaning business began to decline, someone recognized its potential as a children's modeling compound. By 1956, it had been successfully remarketed as a toy. The non toxic, non staining compound was first demonstrated at an educational convention, then appeared in department stores, and soon every child in America had jars of Play Doh and was creating lumpy, colorful sculptures that their parents had to dutifully praise. The smell of Play Doh is instantly recognizable to anyone who played with it, a particular scent that triggers powerful nostalgia. Unlike the actual dough from the 50s, which has long since hardened or been thrown away, the product itself never went away. But those original demonstrations, those first jars in that limited color palette, those early Play Doh creations dried hard and treasured by proud parents, those are all gone now. Viewmasters offered children three-dimensional viewing experiences decades before virtual reality. Though the technology was first introduced in 1939, it reached its cultural peak in the 50s and 60s. These stereoscopic viewers used circular cardboard reels with tiny color photographs. You'd put the reel in the viewer, hold it up to the light, press the lever to advance to the next image, and see scenes in glorious 3D. The reels covered everything: fairy tales, tourist destinations, educational topics, TV shows. Watching Viewmaster Reels was a solitary experience, just you and the viewer, traveling to distant places or following favorite stories, frame by frame. The quality of the 3D effect was surprisingly good, creating genuine depth that seemed almost magical. Later versions were cheaper, more plasticky, but those original 50s Viewmasters with their metal bodies and well crafted reels were works of art. Complete sets, especially rare reels, are now collectibles worth real money. Color forms were created by two art students in the 1950s, and they were brilliantly simple: thin, die cut vinyl pieces that would stick to smooth surfaces through static electricity alone. No glue, no mess, just colorful shapes that could be arranged and rearranged infinitely. The original sets came with simple backgrounds and shapes, but eventually licensed versions featured popular TV shows and characters. Children could create scenes, tell stories, design pictures, all without any permanent consequences. When you were done, you just peeled everything off and started over. In an era before digital screens offered endless creative possibilities, color forms provided reusable, mess free entertainment that kept kids occupied for hours. The tactile satisfaction of pressing those vinyl pieces against the slick background, hearing that soft staticky sound, feeling them stick in place, that's something no app can replicate. Robert the Robot, introduced in 1954 by the Ideal Toy Company, was the first plastic toy robot made in the United States, breaking the monopoly of imported tin robots from Japan. Standing 14 inches tall, Robert moved on wheels via a cable connected, hand cranked remote control. If you wound another crank on his back, he'd announce in a mechanical voice, "I am Robert Robot, Mechanical Man." In the early 50s, science fiction was exploding in popularity, with books like Isaac Asimov's I, Robot, and films like The Day the Earth Stood Still capturing America's imagination about mechanical men and space age futures. Robert the Robot wasn't sophisticated by later standards, but in 1954, a talking, moving robot was the height of futuristic toy technology. Few of these robots survived intact, making original examples quite valuable to collectors. Tin toy robots from Japan flooded the American market in the early 50s. These weren't high tech. They were simple wind up or friction powered toys made from lithographed tin, but they were affordable and captured children's imaginations. Some walked, some moved their arms, some had flashing lights. They came in wild colors and often featured clear plastic domes showing their brains made of visible gears. Each one had its own personality based on its particular combination of movements and sounds. When they broke, which they often did because they were delicate, that was usually it. No repairs, no replacement parts. You moved on to the next tin robot. That disposability means few survived, and pristine examples of obscure models can fetch hundreds of dollars now. Kellogg's cereal box submarines were ingenious little toys that appeared in cereal boxes starting in 1955, patented by brothers Henry and Benjamin Hirsch. These tiny plastic submarines had an empty chamber that could be filled with baking powder before being sealed. When placed in water, the submarine would sink to the bottom. Then the water would react with the baking powder to create carbon dioxide bubbles, which would push the submarine back to the surface. This cycle would repeat several times, giving children a simple but fascinating lesson in chemistry disguised as a toy. Despite being cheap cereal premiums, these submarines were wildly popular, spawning similar baking powder powered products like scuba divers and PT boats. The principle was simple, the execution was clever, and for millions of 50s children, these little submarines provided hours of bathtub entertainment. Wheelo was a hypnotic toy consisting of a metal wheel trapped inside a wire track. You'd hold the track at an angle and move your hands in just the right way, and the wheel would roll around and around, seemingly defying gravity, creating a continuous loop of motion. It was oddly mesmerizing to watch, and learning to control it required practice and patience. Wheelo remained popular for decades, passing through different manufacturers, and knockoffs are still sold online today. But the original 50s version had a particular quality, a smoothness to its operation that later versions never quite matched. Lincoln Logs had existed since the 1910s, but they hit their stride in the 50s as families moved to suburbs with actual yards where children could spread out their toys. These notched wooden logs, dyed brown and looking like miniature logs, could be stacked to build cabins, forts, and frontier settlements. They encouraged creative construction, spatial reasoning, and imaginative play, all without requiring batteries or electricity. The sets smelled like wood, felt substantial in children's hands, and created structures that felt real, solid, like actual buildings in miniature. When plastic construction toys started dominating the market, Lincoln Logs held on through nostalgia and their association with American frontier mythology. But those original wooden sets from the 50s, worn smooth by countless small hands, those are mostly gone now, replaced by plastic versions that miss the point entirely. Board games were family entertainment before television took over entirely. Scrabble had just been introduced in the late 40s, and by 1952 was selling 400 sets a day, becoming the thinking person's game of choice. Monopoly continued its domination as America's favorite capitalism simulation. Clue turned everyone into amateur detectives. Candyland guided small children through a whimsical world of sweets. These games brought families together around the kitchen table or living room floor for hours of face to face interaction, creating memories that lasted lifetimes. Today's families, if they play games at all, often do so digitally, individually, without that physical presence and shared experience that made board game nights special. If the 1950s had a single defining symbol, it might be the automobile, not just any car, but those magnificent, outrageous, chrome laden masterpieces with tail fins reaching toward the sky and bodies stretching out in lengths that seem almost comical now. The car culture of 50s America was so pervasive, so all encompassing, that trying to separate it from the decade itself is like trying to separate water from wetness. The tail fin deserves its own paragraph because it's so emblematic of 50s automotive design philosophy. These fins didn't make cars go faster. They didn't improve performance, handling, or fuel efficiency. They existed purely for style, for spectacle, for that space age aesthetic that made cars look like they were ready to blast off into orbit. Harley Earl, working for General Motors, is widely credited with introducing this revolutionary styling element. According to automotive design history, Earl drew inspiration from studying the Lockheed P 38 fighter plane, which he greatly admired. His vision was to create a car with rear wings that echoed the dramatic lines of the aircraft's tail section. The Cadillac became the first production car to feature these flamboyant rear tail fins, introducing them to an amazed American public. By the mid to late 50s, practically every American car manufacturer had joined the tail fin arms race, each year's models sporting fins that grew larger, more elaborate, more theatrical. The 1959 Cadillac represented what many consider the absolute peak of this trend, with fins so large and prominent they seemed almost absurd. When the 60s arrived with its renewed focus on performance and efficiency, tail fins vanished almost as quickly as they'd appeared, suddenly appearing outdated rather than futuristic. The wraparound windshield was another innovation associated with Earl's design philosophy, which similarly drew from aviation aesthetics. Design historians suggest the bubble canopy of the Lockheed P 38 may have influenced this approach, which increased driver visibility while adding a distinctive look. These windshields curved dramatically around the sides of the car, providing a panoramic view that made driving feel more like piloting a spacecraft. Combined with the increasing size of cars and their powerful engines, the wraparound windshield contributed to that sense of command, of power, of being in control of a magnificent machine. Modern cars still sometimes feature curved windshields, but they lack the dramatic sweep of those 50s designs, that sense of being cocooned in a glass bubble as you cruise down the highway. Two-tone paint jobs were everywhere in the 50s, turning cars into rolling art pieces. These weren't subtle color combinations. We're talking about bold contrasts. Sunset coral paired with seafoam green, turquoise and cream, pink and gray. The dividing line between colors often featured chrome trim that caught the sunlight and announced your presence blocks before you arrived. These paint schemes made each car distinctive, memorable, a reflection of the owner's personality and taste. The colors themselves had names that seemed lifted from paint swatches at a beach resort or a fruit stand. When cars became more serious and performance oriented in later decades, these playful paint combinations largely disappeared, considered frivolous and dated, and chrome, glorious chrome, was absolutely everywhere on 50s cars. Bumpers, grills, trim, door handles, hubcaps, hood ornaments. Some cars had so much chrome they looked like rolling mirrors, reflecting light and scenery as they passed. Maintaining all that chrome was a labor of love. Owners spent hours with chrome polish, rags, and elbow grease, keeping every surface gleaming. When chrome started going out of style in favor of plastic and painted trim, something ineffable was lost. Chrome had weight, permanence, a kind of dignity. It caught light in a way that plastic never could. Those 50s cars positively glowed with their chrome detailing, rolling sculptures that announced prosperity and pride. The dashboard of a 50s car was a spectacular display of analog instrumentation. Speedometers were huge circular dials, often framed in more chrome. Additional gauges tracked oil pressure, engine temperature, fuel level, each with its own needle that trembled and moved as you drove. Some cars had push button automatic transmissions, where you'd press buttons to select your gear rather than using a lever. Radio dials glowed warmly, often in shades of green or amber. Everything was mechanical, tactile, real. You could hear the click and feel the resistance when you adjusted controls. Modern digital dashboards might be more functional, but they lack the soul, the personality, the sense of connection that came from those analog controls. Bench seats were standard in most 50s cars, particularly up front. This meant three people could sit side by side, which sounds uncomfortable but created certain social possibilities. Your date could sit right next to you while you drove, close enough to rest their head on your shoulder. This configuration gave rise to the term six-passenger car, meaning three in front, three in back. When bucket seats became standard in later decades, this cozy seating arrangement disappeared, and with it, what many remember as a more intimate aspect of 50s dating culture. Drive-in movie theaters reached their absolute peak in the 50s, with more than 4,000 operating across America by decade's end. These weren't just movie venues, they were cultural institutions, social gathering spots, and teenage romance enablers. You'd drive in, find a spot, hook a speaker to your car window. The audio quality was terrible, but that wasn't really the point, and pretend to watch the movie while actually doing everything else teenagers wanted to do away from parental supervision. Drive ins showed B movies, horror films, and double features that ran late into the night. They smelled like popcorn, car exhaust, and summer evening air. They were simultaneously wholesome family entertainment and notorious passion pits, depending on who was there and why. When multiplexes offered better sound, better picture quality, and air conditioning, drive ins couldn't compete. Most closed, their massive screens torn down, their acres of car viewing space converted to shopping centers or housing developments. Car hop restaurants represented another distinctly 50s phenomenon. These drive in restaurants, with names like A and W and Sonic, had servers who would come directly to your car to take your order, then return with your food on trays that hooked to your car window. You could eat without ever leaving your vehicle, which seemed to embody modern convenience. The car hops, often teenage girls in uniforms, became iconic figures of the era. Some restaurants even employed car hops on roller skates, who would glide between cars with loaded trays, in what must have required remarkable balance and skill. The job demanded a good memory, physical stamina, and the ability to maintain a pleasant demeanor regardless of tips. While a few car hop restaurants still exist, they're nostalgic throwbacks rather than the mainstream dining option they were in the 50s. Cruising became a major social activity for teenagers, particularly on weekend nights. This meant driving around town, usually on a specific main street or circuit, seeing and being seen, calling out to friends in other cars, occasionally stopping at drive ins or parking lots to hang out. You weren't going anywhere in particular. The driving itself was the point, the activity, the social scene. Cruising showed off your car, announced your presence, and allowed casual interactions with peers in a supervised but parent free environment. When gas got expensive and when teenagers found other ways to socialize, cruising largely died out, though it survives in some communities as deliberate throwback events. Hot rod culture emerged in the late 40s but exploded in the 50s, with young men, almost exclusively men, modifying their cars for performance and style. This meant stripping down older cars, often pre war models, installing more powerful engines, lowering the suspension, removing unnecessary weight, painting them in wild colors. Hot rodders gathered at impromptu drag races, testing their mechanical skills and their nerve on abandoned airstrips and empty roads far from police attention. The National Hot Rod Association formed in 1951 to give this subculture some organization and move racing to official tracks rather than public streets. Hot rod culture represented rebellion through mechanics, a working class pastime that valued skills, creativity, and speed over money and status. The cars these young men built were dangerous, loud, and absolutely magnificent. Station wagons became the minivans of the 50s, the default choice for families who needed to transport multiple children, their friends, sports equipment, groceries, and everything else required for suburban living. These spacious wagons often featured wood look panels on the sides, which were actually printed material, not real wood, and the very back sometimes had rear facing seats, where children sat looking out at the cars behind them, waving at strangers. Station wagons lacked the glamour of sedans or sports cars, but they were practical, roomy, and essential for the chauffeur duties that fell primarily to mothers. A woman whose children played sports, took music lessons, had play dates, and needed rides all over town required a station wagon just to keep everything functioning. The car radio, though not new to the 50s, became essential during this decade. Radio was still the primary source for music, news, and entertainment, and being able to take it with you as you drove felt luxurious. Teenagers in particular embraced the car radio as their soundtrack, tuning into rock and roll stations that their parents wouldn't allow at home. Songs about cars started flooding the airwaves. Rocket 88, about an Oldsmobile. Maybelline, about a lady driving a Cadillac. Beep Beep, with its story of a Nash Rambler and a Cadillac. The car and the music became intertwined, each enhancing the other, creating a mobile personal space where you controlled not just where you went, but what you heard. Power steering and power brakes, though they'd been invented earlier, became standard features on many 50s cars. Before power steering, turning the wheel required genuine physical strength, particularly when parking or maneuvering at low speeds. Before power brakes, stopping a heavy car took real pressure on the pedal. When these power assist features became available, they were marketed as modern conveniences, as labor saving innovations that made driving easier for everyone, but particularly for women who were often assumed to be weaker and less capable drivers. This is problematic to modern ears, but it reflected 50s attitudes about gender and capability. Automatic transmissions also became widespread in the 50s. Manual transmissions required coordination, timing, and practice. You needed to work the clutch pedal, shift the gear lever, and manage the gas pedal all simultaneously. Automatic transmissions eliminated that complexity, making driving accessible to more people and reducing fatigue on long trips. Some purists insisted that real driving meant using a manual transmission, that automatics took away driver control and engagement. This debate continues today among car enthusiasts, but for the average American driver in the 50s, automatic transmissions represented progress and convenience. The 1950s kitchen produced food that was, let's be honest, often bizarre by modern standards. This was an era of convenience foods, canned everything, and creative uses of gelatin that bordered on the disturbing. But it was also when certain classics became established, when brands that still exist today found their footing, and when American eating habits underwent changes that still affect how we eat now. TV dinners represent perhaps the ultimate 50s convenience food. Swanson introduced them in 1953, creating the now iconic aluminum tray with divided compartments. The original version featured turkey, mashed potatoes, and gravy, along with vegetables. The genius was that the entire meal could be heated in the oven while you watched television, hence the name. You didn't need to cook. You didn't need to plan. You just opened your freezer, pulled out your individual TV dinner, heated it up, and ate while watching your programs. For busy families, for single people, for anyone who didn't want to spend time on meal preparation, TV dinners seemed like a miracle. The quality wasn't great by any standard. The vegetables were mushy, the meat was mystery texture, the gravy was questionable, but it was food, it was hot, and it required almost no effort. Over time, the quality improved slightly and the variety expanded, but those original 50s TV dinners were pretty grim eating. Gelatin reached remarkable popularity in the 1950s. Jello itself had been around for decades, but the 50s took gelatin applications to unusual extremes. Savory gelatin dishes, or aspics, involved suspending meat or vegetables in clear, savory gelatin. Tomato aspic was a particular favorite, a jiggly red tomato flavored gelatin often molded into elaborate shapes. But it wasn't just tomatoes. People put everything in gelatin: shredded carrots, peas, green beans, cottage cheese, canned fruit cocktail, even seafood. The perfection salad featuring shredded vegetables and lime gelatin became a centerpiece at dinner parties. Several factors likely contributed to this trend. Gelatin was seen as elegant and modern, a way to create elaborate looking dishes with relatively little effort. Additionally, refrigerators with reliable freezer compartments were still new enough that successfully molding gelatin dishes demonstrated you owned modern appliances. Perhaps most significantly, food magazines and brand sponsored recipe cards promoted gelatin recipes extensively. Understanding that much of this culinary phenomenon was driven by marketing from gelatin manufacturers helps explain its widespread adoption. Jello wanted to increase sales, so they published cookbooks and advertisements suggesting virtually any ingredient could be suspended in gelatin, and remarkably, homemakers embraced these suggestions. Canned food reached new heights of ubiquity in the 50s. Chef Boyardee, Campbell's, Spam, Underwood deviled ham, Van Camp beans, Dinty Moore beef stew, all of these became household names. Entire meals came from cans. Breakfast might include canned orange juice. Lunch could be Campbell's soup. Dinner might feature casseroles made from cream of mushroom soup, canned green beans, and canned fried onions. Spam, which had been vital during World War II as military rations, continued as a staple protein, particularly in regions where its influence never faded. The appeal of canned food was obvious: long shelf life, no refrigeration needed until opened, consistent quality, and fast preparation. The downside was also obvious: lower nutritional value, high sodium content, and taste that ranged from acceptable to actively bad. But in an era that prized convenience above almost everything else, these concerns seemed minor. Frozen vegetables complemented the canned options. Bird's Eye and other brands offered frozen peas, corn, green beans, spinach, asparagus, everything you might want. These were marketed as fresher and more nutritious than canned vegetables, which was often true, though still not as good as fresh produce. But fresh vegetables weren't always available, particularly in winter or in regions far from agricultural areas. Frozen vegetables meant you could have variety year round without relying entirely on cans. The process of preparing them was simple: dump the frozen block into boiling water or a pan, heat until cooked, season, serve. The texture was often mushy and the flavor muted, but they were vegetables, and they fulfilled the obligation to serve vegetables with dinner, even if nobody actually enjoyed eating them. Casseroles dominated 50s dinner tables. These one dish meals combined protein, often canned tuna or chicken, starch, egg noodles or rice, vegetables, usually canned or frozen, and a binding sauce, cream of mushroom soup being the most popular. Everything went into a baking dish, was topped with something crunchy, crushed crackers, fried onions, or breadcrumbs, then baked until bubbly. Casseroles were economical, feeding large families from relatively cheap ingredients. They were also perfect for potlucks and church dinners, where you needed to transport a complete dish that would stay warm and serve many people. Some casseroles were actually good. Others were grim slurries of overcooked elements that bore no relation to food as it might exist in nature. But good or bad, casseroles were everywhere, and most Americans of a certain age have strong memories, not all positive, of specific casseroles from their childhood. Campbell's tomato soup cake sounds peculiar, but was actually a popular dessert in many American homes. Historical records suggest Campbell's created the recipe sometime in the 1920s or 30s, though it gained its widest popularity in the 50s. The key ingredient was a can of Campbell's condensed tomato soup, mixed into a spice cake batter with flour, butter, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and sugar. The result tasted like a dense, moist spice cake, not particularly like tomatoes. The soup added moisture and a certain richness. It was marketed as an economical way to make cake when ingredients were expensive or rationed, but people continued making it even when rationing ended, sometimes simply because it was what they knew, what their mothers had made. Campbell's printed the recipe on soup can labels, ensuring new generations would discover this bizarre but weirdly successful combination. Macaroni loaf took macaroni and cheese in an unusual direction. This dish involved making cheese sauce, mixing it with cooked macaroni, pouring it into a loaf pan, and baking it in a bain marie hot water bath until it held its shape. When unmolded, you'd get a loaf of macaroni and cheese that could be sliced. It would typically be served surrounded by tomato sauce and canned sliced mushrooms for presentation. The appeal likely came from several factors. It looked impressive for dinner parties, it demonstrated knowledge of fancy French cooking techniques, and it offered a novel presentation of a familiar dish, even if the traditional version probably tasted better. Deviled eggs were everywhere at any gathering. These weren't complicated. Hard boiled eggs halved, yolks mixed with mayonnaise and mustard, spooned or piped back into the whites, perhaps garnished with paprika or a tiny piece of olive. They were easy to make, transported reasonably well, looked attractive on a platter, and most people liked them. Deviled eggs haven't completely disappeared, but they're far less common now than they were in the 50s, when they were essentially mandatory at any social gathering. Pineapple upside down cake became hugely popular, helped by pie o my cake mix that included a can of pineapple rings and red cherries. The technique involved placing pineapple slices and cherries in the bottom of a pan with brown sugar and butter, pouring cake batter over them, baking, then flipping the cake upside down so the caramelized fruit became the top. It was showy, tasted good, used convenient canned ingredients, and became a classic diner dessert that still occasionally appears as a nostalgic treat. Banana splits reached their peak as diner treats in the 50s. The construction was specific: banana sliced lengthwise, laid in a boat shaped dish, topped with 3 scoops of ice cream, traditionally chocolate, vanilla and strawberry, drizzled with chocolate syrup, strawberry syrup, and pineapple topping, then finished with whipped cream, maraschino cherries, and chopped nuts. Making a proper banana split was a performance, a skill that good soda jerks took pride in. The result was an enormous, elaborate dessert that was almost impossible to finish and certainly impossible to eat elegantly. But that was part of the appeal. The banana split represented indulgence, celebration, treating yourself or someone special to something over the top. Beaumont seasoning was a popular spice blend in the 50s and 60s, particularly in the South. Trademarked by Spice Island Seasonings, it combined celery seeds, salt, and onion powder, providing an instant flavor burst to bland casseroles and other dishes. Having a jar in your spice cabinet marked you as someone who cooked with seasonings beyond just salt and pepper. When more elaborate spice blends became available, and when people started cooking with fresh herbs and more diverse seasonings, Beaumont faded away, remembered now mainly by people who grew up watching their mothers reach for that specific jar. Cocktail culture was huge in the 50s, with adults regularly mixing elaborate drinks at home. This wasn't just beer or wine with dinner. This was gin and tonics, martinis, both gin and vodka, Manhattans, old fashions, whiskey sours, and newer creations like the pink squirrel, creme de noyau, creme de cacao, and cream. Bar carts were standard living room furniture, stocked with multiple spirits, liqueurs, bitters, and mixers. Cocktail shakers, jiggers, strainers, and other specialized equipment was necessary. Knowing how to mix drinks properly was a social skill, particularly for men. The culture around cocktails was sophisticated, adult, a marker of having arrived at a certain level of refinement. When wine became more popular and when simpler drinks like beer and single spirit cocktails dominated, the elaborate cocktail culture of the 50s faded, though it's seen periodic revivals among craft cocktail enthusiasts. Beyond the kitchen and wardrobe, 50s households were filled with specific items that defined daily life, but have since disappeared so completely that explaining them to younger generations requires context and patience. These were the objects that filled drawers, sat on shelves, hung on walls, and generally made a house feel like a home in that particular era. Milk delivery was standard in many neighborhoods, with milk bottles left on doorsteps early in the morning. These weren't plastic jugs. They were glass bottles with thick walls and narrow necks, sealed with cardboard caps. Milkmen would deliver fresh bottles and take away empties for cleaning and reuse. Some homes had milk chutes, small insulated compartments built into the exterior wall where bottles could be left safely. The milk was usually very fresh, often delivered the same day it was bottled, with cream floating at the top that you'd either shake to mix in or skim off for coffee. As supermarkets became more convenient and as refrigeration improved, milk delivery declined. Today, it exists mainly as a boutique service in some upscale neighborhoods, a nostalgic throwback rather than a practical necessity. Carbon paper was essential for anyone who needed to make copies of documents. This thin paper had one side coated with dark pigment, usually purple or black. You'd place a sheet of carbon paper between two sheets of regular paper, then write or type on the top sheet. The pressure would transfer the pigment to the bottom sheet, creating a duplicate. Carbon paper was messy, leaving smudges on fingers, and sometimes creating blurry, hard to read copies. But it was the only way most people could make duplicates before photocopiers became common. Secretaries used multiple sheets of carbon paper to create numerous copies simultaneously. The copies got progressively fainter, and the process required strong, even typing to ensure every letter transferred clearly. When photocopiers and later computer printers arrived, carbon paper became obsolete almost immediately. Some offices kept boxes of it around for years afterward, just in case, but those just in case moments never came. Handkerchiefs were used instead of disposable tissues. Men carried cloth handkerchiefs in their pockets. Women had decorative handkerchiefs tucked in their purses. These weren't single use items. You'd blow your nose into a handkerchief, fold it, and put it back in your pocket or purse, then take it home to be washed with the laundry. This seems unhygienic by modern standards, and honestly, it kind of was. But it was normal, expected, what people did. Disposable tissues existed by the 50s, but they were seen as wasteful, an unnecessary expense when you could just wash and reuse handkerchiefs. When disposable tissues became cheap enough and socially acceptable, handkerchiefs faded rapidly. Men still sometimes carry them for show, but actual regular use of cloth handkerchiefs has largely disappeared. Cigarette cases and holders were ubiquitous accessories in a decade when smoking was not only acceptable but actively encouraged. Elegant cigarette cases, often made of metal with decorative designs, held a dozen or more cigarettes and protected them from crushing. Cigarette holders, particularly the long ones that women used, were seen as sophisticated and glamorous. Ashtrays were everywhere, in living rooms, bedrooms, cars, restaurants, offices, even hospitals. The idea that smoking might be unhealthy was barely discussed, and the social infrastructure supported smoking everywhere all the time. When smoking was increasingly recognized as dangerous, and when anti smoking campaigns reduced its social acceptability, all these accessories became useless. Cigarette cases became vintage collectibles. Cigarette holders disappeared entirely except as costume pieces. Ashtrays moved from ubiquitous to rare, from functional items to antiquarian curiosities. Party line telephones meant that multiple households shared a single phone line. You could pick up your phone and hear your neighbor's conversation in progress. You'd have to wait for them to finish before making your own call. And they could listen to your conversations too, sometimes deliberately eavesdropping, sometimes just accidentally picking up the phone at the wrong moment. Privacy was non existent. Gossip spread fast because everyone could literally hear everyone else's business. As soon as private phone lines became affordable, people switched immediately. Nobody missed party lines except as sources of nostalgic stories about nosy neighbors and the bad old days. Ringer mops had long handles attached to a mop head, and they came with a bucket that had built in rollers. You'd soak the mop in soapy water, then press it against the rollers and pull, wringing out the excess water. This required some strength and technique to avoid getting dirty water everywhere, but it worked, and it was the standard way to mop floors throughout the 50s. Self-wringing mops and later products like Swiffer wet jets made wringer mops obsolete, joining the long list of cleaning tools that required more physical effort than modern people want to expend. Door-to-door salesmen were a regular part of life. Encyclopedia salesmen, vacuum cleaner salesmen, Fuller brush men, Avon ladies, they came right to your door with samples and sales pitches. Some families built relationships with regular salespeople, buying from them for years. Others found the intrusions annoying but tolerated them as part of normal life. The door to door sales model depended on limited retail options and on the fact that most women were home during the day. As more women entered the workforce and as retail options expanded, door to door sales declined. Today, except for occasional attempts to sell security systems or solar panels, the door to door salesman is effectively extinct. Rotary dial phones were the height of modern communication technology. Making a call required patience. You'd place your finger in the hole corresponding to the number you wanted, rotate the dial clockwise until it stopped, then release it and wait for it to return to its starting position before dialing the next number. Long distance numbers with multiple high digits 8, 9, 0, which were furthest from the starting position, took forever to dial. Messing up meant starting over. The distinctive sound of a rotary dial phone, that clicking and whirring, became so iconic that it's still sometimes used in movies and TV to indicate old fashioned or vintage. When push-button touch-tone phones arrived in 1963, rotary phones immediately seemed antiquated, though many remained in service for years because they were durable, and people saw no reason to replace something that still worked. S&H Green stamps represented a whole system of retail loyalty programs. Supermarkets, gas stations, and other retailers would give you green stamps based on your purchases. You'd collect these stamps in special books, licking each stamp to make it stick. When you'd filled enough books, you could redeem them for items from a catalog, kitchen appliances, toys, household goods, even furniture. Some families collected stamps religiously, seeing it as free money, a way to get things they couldn't otherwise afford. Others found the whole process tedious. The stamps themselves were thin paper, easily damaged, and licking dozens of them to fill a book was unpleasant. When credit card rewards programs offered simpler point systems, green stamps and similar programs disappeared, though the basic concept of retail loyalty rewards lives on. Clothes wringers were dangerous devices attached to washing machines. After clothes were washed, you'd feed them through two rubber rollers that squeezed out the water. This required careful attention because if you weren't paying close attention, you could easily catch your fingers, your hair, or loose clothing in those relentless rollers. Women suffered injuries from these devices with some regularity, but they were considered necessary because early washing machines didn't have spin cycles to remove water. The alternative was wringing clothes by hand, which was exhausting. When automatic washers with built in spin cycles became standard, clothes wringers vanished immediately, and nobody mourned their passing. Coal chutes were built into many homes, allowing coal deliveries to be dumped directly into basement storage bins. Coal furnaces heated most homes before natural gas and oil became standard. The coal chute was typically a metal door or window on the exterior of the house, positioned above the basement coal bin. When the coal truck arrived, they'd connect a chute from the truck to your home's coal chute and let the coal slide down. It was loud, dirty, and created coal dust throughout the basement. but it was how homes stayed warm in winter. As cleaner heating systems replaced coal furnaces, coal chutes became obsolete architectural features, sometimes converted into storage, sometimes sealed up entirely, their original purpose forgotten by younger generations who never experienced coal heat. The 1950s existed in this weird transitional space technologically. Television was becoming common, but still new enough to be special. Computers existed, but were enormous. Expensive machines used only by large corporations and government agencies. Most communication and information storage relied on physical objects in ways that seem almost unbelievable now. The television antenna, often called rabbit ears for indoor versions or referred to as an aerial for rooftop versions, was absolutely essential. You couldn't just plug in your TV and watch. You needed an antenna to pick up broadcast signals. Indoor antennas required careful positioning and adjustment. You'd move them around, twist them, adjust the angle, all while someone watched the screen and shouted whether the picture was getting better or worse. Some channels came in clear, others were fuzzy, with ghosts and snow. Some didn't come in at all, depending on where you lived. Rooftop antennas required installation by professionals or brave homeowners willing to climb onto their roof. These large metal structures became fixtures of the suburban landscape, forests of metal arms all pointing toward the nearest broadcast tower. When cable television arrived, antennas became obsolete. Today, over the air broadcasting has made a small comeback as people cut their cable subscriptions, but the experience is completely different from the ritual of antenna adjustment that 50s families knew so well. Black and white televisions were the centerpiece of living rooms, even though color television technology existed by the mid 50s. Color sets were too expensive for most families until the late 60s. These black and white sets were boxy, heavy, furniture like objects that required dedicated space. The screens were small by modern standards, maybe 21 inches diagonal at most. The picture was fuzzy by contemporary standards, but seemed miraculous to people who'd grown up with only radio. Families gathered around the television to watch variety shows, sitcoms, news, and whatever else was being broadcast. Only a handful of channels existed, so watching television meant choosing from limited options rather than scrolling through hundreds of channels or streaming services. The communal nature of watching whatever was on at that particular time created shared cultural experiences that don't really exist anymore in our era of personalized on demand entertainment. Vacuum tubes powered most electronic devices before transistors took over. Radios, televisions, amplifiers, all relied on these glass tubes that glowed warm when turned on and eventually burned out like light bulbs. When a tube failed, you'd need to identify which one was bad, pull it out, take it to a hardware store that had a tube tester, test it, buy a replacement, and install it. This required knowledge and patience. Many men prided themselves on being able to diagnose and fix their own televisions and radios by replacing tubes. Whole stores existed that sold nothing but tubes and related parts. When transistors and later integrated circuits replaced tubes, they were more reliable, smaller, and didn't generate as much heat. But something was lost, that ability to understand and repair your own electronics, that visible glowing technology that you could actually see working. Record players, specifically the console models that combined radio and record player in one large piece of furniture, were status symbols. These weren't small portable devices. They were substantial pieces of furniture, often made of wood with fabric covered speakers, that sat prominently in the living room. You'd lift the lid to reveal the turntable, place a record, set the speed, 78, 45, or 33 and 1/3 RPM, depending on the record. Lower the needle carefully into the groove and wait for the music to start. The sound quality was warm, analog, with the pops and crackles that came from imperfections in the vinyl or dust on the needle. Building a record collection required money and dedication. Each album was a significant purchase. You'd listen repeatedly to the albums you owned, learning every song, every lyric, every instrumental flourish. This was fundamentally different from today's streaming culture where millions of songs are available instantly but often feel disposable. Library card catalogs were the search engines of the 50s. These large wooden cabinets filled with small drawers contained thousands of index cards, each representing a book in the library's collection. To find a book, you'd search through cards filed alphabetically by author, title, or subject. Each card contained the book's call number, which you'd write down, then use to locate the actual book on the shelves. Librarians maintained these catalogs meticulously, typing new cards for every book acquired, filing them precisely, removing cards for books that were discarded. The catalog was a physical database, a marvel of paper based information management. When computerized catalogs arrived, searching became faster and more flexible, but something was lost. That tactile experience of flipping through cards, that serendipitous discovery of interesting books filed near the one you were looking for. Slide projectors brought vacation photos to life in ways that seem quaint now. You'd take photos on slide film, send it away for development, receive your slides back in small cardboard mounts, then load them into a circular carousel or rectangular tray that fit into your slide projector. In a darkened room, you'd project large, bright images onto a wall or screen while narrating your vacation for captive audiences of family and friends. The click, click, click of the projector advancing to the next slide, the brilliant colors of Kodachrome film, the occasional upside down or backward slide that prompted laughter. These were rituals of mid century family life. When print photos became more convenient, and later when digital photos eliminated physical media entirely, slide projectors and their carousels became garage sale fodder. Reel to reel tape recorders allowed people to record and play back audio, but they were complex, expensive, and required technical knowledge. The recorder would have two reels, one with tape wound onto it, the supply reel, and one empty, the take up reel. You'd thread the tape from the supply reel through the recording or playback heads and attach it to the take up reel, then wind it on and start playing or recording. The tape was fragile and could easily tangle, stretch, or break. Editing tape meant physically cutting it with a razor blade and splicing pieces together with special tape. Professional recordings, radio programs, and serious audio enthusiasts used reel to reel, but for most people it was too complicated. When cassette tapes offered easier recording with better reliability, reel to reel recorders became niche products for audiophiles and professionals. The daily rituals of personal care and grooming in the 50s involved products and practices that seem unusual or unnecessary now, reflecting very different beauty standards and social expectations, particularly for women. The amount of time and effort people devoted to grooming in the 50s reveals much about the era's values around appearance and propriety. Brill cream was the default hair product for men who wanted that slicked back look. A little dab'll do ya, the advertisements promised, and men across America responded by slathering their hair with this petroleum based pomade. The result was shiny, immovable hair that looked wet all day long. You could see the comb marks frozen in place. It had a distinctive smell, slightly medicinal, instantly recognizable to anyone whose father or grandfather used it. The product left residue on pillowcases and shirt collars. When more natural looking styles became popular in later decades, Brile cream usage plummeted. The product still exists, reformulated for modern preferences, but the original thick, shiny Brile cream and the hairstyles it enabled are gone. Marcelling irons and permanent wave solutions subjected women's hair to significant stress in pursuit of fashionable curls and waves. The permanent wave process involved applying chemical solutions, wrapping hair around rods, applying heat, neutralizing the chemicals, then carefully unwrapping to reveal curls that would supposedly last for months. The chemicals smelled terrible, burned if they touched your scalp, and sometimes caused hair to become damaged or even break off. But having a permanent was considered essential for achieving the proper hairstyles. Similarly, women who wanted finger waves or marcelled hair would have their hair pressed with heated irons, creating waves and S curves that stayed in place with massive amounts of hairspray. The amount of time, money, and discomfort women endured for their hair in the 50s would surprise most modern women. Pond's cold cream was the standard method for removing makeup. This thick, white, slightly greasy cream would be slathered on the face, rubbed around to dissolve makeup, then wiped off with tissues or a washcloth. It was effective but left skin feeling oily. Most women used it nightly as part of their bedtime routine, sitting at their vanity tables in bathrobes, creaming and wiping, until their faces were clean. The scent of Pond's cold cream, slightly floral and medicinal, evokes powerful memories for people who remember their mothers or grandmothers using it. Modern makeup removers are more convenient and less greasy, but Pond's represented a whole ritual, a performance of feminine beauty maintenance that was considered essential. Aquanet hairspray came in those iconic aerosol cans and was used in substantial quantities to achieve and maintain the elaborate hairstyles fashionable in the 50s. Beehives, bouffants, flips, all of these required hairspray, lots of it, sprayed on in layers to build height and hold. The result was hair so stiff it could barely move. Women sleeping carefully on their styled hair to preserve it could keep these hairstyles intact for days, sometimes even a week. The amount of chemicals people were spraying directly onto their heads and breathing in seems concerning by today's standards, but it was simply part of the beauty routine at the time. When more natural hairstyles became fashionable, hairspray usage dropped dramatically, though it never disappeared completely. Max Factor makeup, particularly the pancake makeup, was what movie stars used, and by extension, what women who wanted to look like movie stars used. This thick, heavy makeup came in a compact cake that you'd wet and apply to your face with a damp sponge, building up opaque coverage that hid every imperfection but also looked rather mask like. The goal wasn't natural appearance, it was perfection, smoothness, an airbrushed look decades before Photoshop existed. Combined with heavily drawn eyebrows, dramatic eye makeup, and bright lipstick, 50s makeup created a very specific look that was considered beautiful but required skill and time to achieve properly. Electric razors for men were marketed as modern, convenient alternatives to traditional shaving with blade razors and cream. These early electric razors were loud, pulled hair uncomfortably, and often required multiple passes to achieve a close shave, but they eliminated the need for shaving cream and running water, making them convenient for travel or quick touch ups. Men debated endlessly about whether electric or blade razors gave a better shave, with loyalists on both sides. The debate continues today, though modern electric razors are vastly improved from their 50s ancestors. Home permanent kits became popular in the 50s, allowing women to give themselves perms at home rather than visiting a salon. Brands like Tony and Lilt marketed these kits heavily, promising salon results at a fraction of the cost. The kits contained chemical solutions, plastic rods, and detailed instructions. The process was time consuming and required help from a friend or family member. The smell of home permanent solution was distinctive and unpleasant, lingering in the house for hours. Results were unpredictable. Sometimes the perm took beautifully, other times hair ended up overprocessed, frizzy, or barely curled at all. Despite the risks, millions of women used home permanent kits throughout the 50s, accepting the occasional disaster as the price of economical beauty maintenance. Noxzema skin cream was ubiquitous in 50s bathrooms, that distinctive blue jar with white lettering. Originally marketed as a treatment for sunburn and skin irritation, it evolved into an all-purpose facial cleanser and moisturizer. The cream had a strong medicinal scent, cooling and slightly menthol-like. Women used it to remove makeup, treat blemishes, soothe irritated skin, and moisturize before bed. The smell of Noxzema is one of those sensory memories that instantly transports people back to their childhood bathrooms. While the product still exists, it's lost its central place in American bathrooms, replaced by more specialized skincare products. Witch hazel was another bathroom staple, used as an astringent and skin toner. Women would apply it with cotton balls after cleansing, believing it closed pores and tightened skin. The clear liquid had a medicinal smell and a cooling sensation when applied. It was also used to treat minor cuts, insect bites, and various skin irritations. While witch hazel hasn't disappeared entirely, it's far less common now than it was in the 50s, when it was considered an essential part of any woman's skincare routine. We've journeyed through hundreds of forgotten things tonight, objects and customs that once seemed as permanent as the stars but have vanished like morning dew. 500 items that shaped daily life in the 1950s America, 500 threads in the fabric of a decade that's slipping further into history with each passing year. What strikes me most about this exploration is not how different the 50s were from now, though they certainly were different. It's how normal everything seemed at the time, how natural and inevitable. Nobody in 1955 thought their lever style ice cube trays would become antiques. Nobody imagined that rotary phones would be replaced by devices that fit in your pocket and connect instantly to the entire world. Nobody suspected that those towering tail fins would seem ridiculous within just a few years. Each generation believes their normal is permanent, that the way they live is more or less how things will always be. They can't imagine the cascade of changes that will render their everyday objects obsolete, their customs quaint, their concerns irrelevant. And yet it happens, generation after generation, era after era. The things we use every day, the products we can't imagine living without, they're all temporary. They're all on their way to becoming someone's forgotten curiosity, someone's research project, someone's late night YouTube video topic. The 50s teach us about the pace of change. Most of these objects didn't disappear overnight. They faded gradually, year by year, as something slightly better came along, as tastes changed, as technology advanced. Your mother stopped using her lever style ice cube trays when your parents bought a new refrigerator with an automatic ice maker. Your grandmother kept wearing gloves to church long after most women had stopped. Your grandfather's rotary phone worked perfectly fine for decades after push button phones became standard, so why replace it? But eventually, everything gets replaced. The old things break down or wear out or become so far removed from current practice that keeping them becomes an active choice, a deliberate embrace of nostalgia rather than just continuing to use what you've always used. Looking back at the 50s from our vantage point 70 years later, we can see how that decade was caught between worlds. They had television but still relied heavily on radio and newspapers. They had electric appliances but still used manual tools for many tasks. They had cars, but public transportation was still vital for many people. They had frozen and canned foods, but fresh cooking from scratch was still standard. They were modern, but not too modern, progressive, but not too progressive. It was a sweet spot of change, a moment when the future felt exciting and full of promise rather than overwhelming and frightening. Many of the forgotten things we've discussed tonight disappeared for good reasons. Wringer washers were dangerous and inconvenient. Carbon paper was messy and produced poor copies. Lever ice cube trays were nowhere near as convenient as automatic ice makers. Sometimes progress actually is progress, and old ways deserve to be abandoned. But other forgotten things had value that we lost when they disappeared. The ritual of making coffee in a stovetop percolator, taking time and paying attention, the durability of appliances built to last for decades rather than years, the communal experience of watching whatever was on television at that moment rather than everyone retreating to their own screens to watch their own customized content, the skills required to repair your own electronics, to maintain your own car, to create things with your hands rather than buying disposable replacements. There was also a sense of shared experience in the 50s that's harder to achieve now. When only three television networks existed, much of America watched the same shows at the same time, creating national conversations. When radio stations had limited reach, local communities shared musical tastes and cultural references. When products had limited distribution, regional differences meant something. That homogeneity had its downsides, certainly, but it also created a kind of social cohesion that's more difficult in our fragmented, personalized, algorithm driven era. The 50s weren't perfect, far from it. They were shot through with racism, sexism, homophobia, conformity, and countless other problems. Many people who lived through that decade were marginalized, oppressed, or actively harmed by the social structures and attitudes of the time. We shouldn't romanticize or idealize it, but we can acknowledge that some things were lost along with all the necessary changes, that some babies got thrown out with the bathwater. The objects we've remembered tonight were more than just things. They were part of systems, part of ways of life that made sense within their context, but couldn't survive the transitions to come. The milkman wasn't just delivering milk, he was part of a local economy, a neighborhood social network, a daily rhythm that structured time differently than our current relationship with food sourcing. The rotary phone wasn't just a communication device. It required patience, made long distance calls precious and brief, connected people in ways that respected the expense and effort involved. The TV dinner wasn't just a convenient meal, it represented changing family dynamics, shifting gender roles, the commercialization of domesticity, and new relationships between time, labor, and consumption. As we close this long evening of remembrance, I'm reminded that future generations will do this same exercise about our era. 30 years from now, someone will make a video about 500 forgotten things from the 2020s, and people will be amazed at how we lived. They'll laugh at our smartphones that couldn't do whatever future technology does. They'll be bewildered by our streaming services and our social media. They'll wonder how we managed without whatever conveniences and technologies they take for granted. And that's okay. That's how time works. Nothing lasts forever except change itself. The things that seem permanent are temporary. The concerns that seem vital are forgotten. The objects that fill our homes and lives will all become someone else's curiosities eventually. But tonight, for these few hours, we remembered. We walked through 50s kitchens, examining forgotten appliances. We tried on forgotten fashions, accessorizing with gloves and hats and spectacles. We played with forgotten toys, drove forgotten cars, ate forgotten foods. We brought back, if only in our minds, a world that's gone. Those of you who remember the 50s, I hope this brought back memories, some happy, some bittersweet. Those of you too young to remember, I hope this gave you a glimpse into a world that shaped the one you inhabit now, that helped you understand your parents or grandparents a little better, that made you appreciate both how far we've come and what we've lost along the way. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight, for indulging in this slow exploration of forgotten things. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, please like the video. If you want more of these deep historical dives, subscribe to the channel, but only if it genuinely resonates with you. No pressure, no hard sell, just an invitation to keep exploring together. Until next time, take care of yourselves, appreciate the present, even as we honor the past. And maybe, just maybe, take a moment to notice the things around you right now that will one day be forgotten, that will one day be someone's curiosity, someone's nostalgia, someone's research project. Nothing lasts forever, but everything matters while it's here. Sweet dreams, everyone. See you next time.